In the midst of war crimes, doctors are generally considered immune to being deliberately targeted, whether by social conventions or international laws. However, in many cases, these conventions are ignored in the heat of battle, leading to the intentional targeting of those who should be considered untouchable. Japanese propaganda defined the Japanese soldier as someone who fought for his country, his family, his honor, and for a higher power. On the other hand, Japanese propaganda portrayed American and Allied soldiers as greedy and cowardly, believing that America's advantage and superior resources could be overcome by breaking the weak spirit or will to fight of the Americans. One strategy to break the American spirit would be to aim at the doctors, which theoretically would damage morale on the battlefield. How did the Japanese view doctors, and did they target doctors intentionally? And if so, why did they do this? Prepare yourself, because the atrocities that surround this subject go beyond imagination. In February 1942, at the Alexander Hospital in Singapore, Japanese soldiers massacred between 150 and 200 staff members and patients. In China, the crimes were far worse. Just as shown in films, it didn't take long before American doctors chose not to wear their Red Cross insignias in battle against the Japanese. A doctor, Dr. Paul Tatsuguchi, trained in California in the 1930s, fighting in the Battle of Attu, narrated his experience serving as a medical officer for the Imperial Army. An excerpt from his last diary entry. The final attack is about to be carried out. All the patients in the hospital were ordered to commit suicide. Only 33 years of life, and I am about to die. I attended to all the patients with grenades. Farewell, Taiko, my beloved wife, who loved me until the end. The origins of formal protections for medical personnel on the battlefield come from the First Geneva Convention, which began as an agreement exclusively between European states. This treaty was established in 1864. Article 6 of the document states, "Evacuations of wounded soldiers, along with the persons under whose direction they occur, must be protected by absolute neutrality." Article 7 of the First Geneva Convention established the precedent for identifying a combat medic. A distinctive and uniform flag shall be adopted for hospitals, ambulances, and evacuations. It shall, on all occasions, be accompanied by the national flag. An arm badge, armband, shall also be allowed for neutralized individuals, but its delivery shall be left to the military authority. The flag and the arm badge shall bear a red cross on a white background. Other non-European states that have since joined the First Geneva Convention adopted other symbols, such as the Red Crescent or the Red Star of David, in place of the cross, but the basic scheme remains intact. A red-on-white pattern is prominent and easy to identify. Combat medics after 1864 wore the identifier on their helmets, as well as on armbands. The First Geneva Convention, whose objective is the improvement of the condition of the wounded and sick in armed forces in the field, saw revisions in 1906, 1929, and 1949, which expanded protections. Among modern protections for combat medics is the prohibition against taking them as prisoners of war in most cases. This protection reads, "Members of this personnel shall not be considered prisoners of war. If they fall into the hands of the adversary, they shall be released, unless the number of prisoners of war and their state of health require otherwise, in which case the medical personnel must receive the necessary facilities and rights to ensure respect for medical ethics." Furthermore, if prisoners of war have medical experience, they may be required to perform medical duties in the interest of other prisoners. In such cases, they have the same rights as the rest of the medical personnel. Additionally, on the battlefield, medical personnel can never be punished for performing their duties, provided they are in accordance with medical ethics, a protection that also extends to civilians who may be performing such medical duties. Occupying powers also have the duty to ensure the maintenance of all medical facilities and activities, and must allow medical practitioners in the territory they occupy to perform their functions without hindrance. The protections for doctors in the modern Geneva Convention are so extensive that they are granted almost complete freedom of movement as their duties require. More protections for medical personnel on the battlefield are specified in the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907. It is understandable why the protection of combat doctors would be so prioritized. The United States Army estimates that about 20% of combat-related deaths are avoidable if wounded soldiers can receive medical care in time. As many as 50% of wounded soldiers die in combat due to severe blood loss, with 86% of combat fatalities occurring within half an hour of the injury. Rapid medical attention and evacuation can prevent these things from occurring. Besides humanitarian reasons, these statistics remind us that there may be an element of mutual cynicism involved in the protection of doctors. Wounded soldiers who are saved have a chance to return to the front lines and remain active for their country during the war. Dead soldiers mark the end of their usefulness. In modern warfare, it is common for doctors to carry weapons, and this practice originated in the Second World War. Before that, there was no explicit statement on the matter, but the general practice was that doctors should not carry weapons so as not to be confused with regular combat soldiers. During World War II, doctors generally did not carry weapons so as not to lose the protections granted to them by the Geneva and Hague Conventions. Some of them, however, carried secondary weapons, and this proved to be the beginning of a trend that the war would reinforce. Despite its brutality elsewhere, Nazi Germany was a signatory to the First Geneva Convention and generally respected enemy personnel who wore the clear markers of a combat medic, at least on the Western Front. On the Eastern Front, things were different. Neither the Russian Empire nor its successor state, the Soviet Union, were parties to the First Geneva Convention at the time. And while the Russian Empire signed the Hague Convention, it did so with reservations. The Soviet Union also was never confirmed as a party to the Hague Conventions. As a result of this, and of the policy of Lebensraum, in which the inhabitants of Eastern Europe were seen as undesirables who needed to be dispossessed of their lands for Germans to colonize, Nazi Germany did not differentiate Soviet doctors from other soldiers, either as combatants or as prisoners of war. Naturally, the Soviet Union treated German doctors the same way. The Japanese also had little regard for doctors. Despite being signatories to the First Geneva Convention, Japanese soldiers often deliberately targeted doctors to cause more chaos in enemy forces and demoralize the wounded men under their care. The practice was so widespread that Japanese soldiers tended to shout "medic," specifically in English, to lure them into their sights. Unfortunately for doctors, their prominent insignia made them very easy for Japanese soldiers to target. The protection these symbols were supposed to provide instead became the most dangerous thing a doctor could carry. This is why, as the Pacific War progressed, medics and corpsmen removed their distinctive uniforms, looking and acting more like regular soldiers. These roles included the fact that they were armed and fighting side by side with regular soldiers. As we have seen, these acts violated the Geneva Convention and therefore renounced the protection granted to doctors. However, in practice, these protections had been rendered irrelevant long before. Japan signed the Geneva Convention in 1929 but did not ratify it. Instead, the Japanese government simply declared in 1942 that it would respect the rules. Therefore, shooting at doctors technically did not violate Japanese law or treaty law. Japanese soldiers did not need to fear any form of punishment from their own justice system for doing so. The idea of a soldier being punished for shooting a doctor would seem absurd when compared to larger atrocities against medical teams, hospitals, and hospital ships that occurred during the war. So why did the Japanese seemingly have no respect for the Red Cross or the treatment of the wounded? Japan became a military dictatorship in the 1930s, which involved the resurgence of nationalism and the revival of the Bushido tradition, a moral code dating back to the time of the samurai, dictating how a warrior should think and behave. Self-sacrifice, or giving oneself to the state or the cause, is central to this warrior code. The Japanese believed that being captured or even disengaging from a fight due to wounds was dishonorable. Many fanatics believed that a man who hid behind an injury or surrendered was unworthy of consideration. It was not uncommon, for example, for men who could not be treated and returned to the fight to commit suicide instead of being captured in their wounded or defenseless state. However, acts such as these were not completely aligned with early 20th century Japanese culture. Japan in the 20th century had fairly modern medical practices, largely modeled after German medicine, and although, like the Germans, it lacked certain medications such as penicillin and relied on less effective sulfa drugs for infections, they typically had the same medical technology as the West Japan during the Russo-Japanese War, had the largest Red Cross society in the world, with more than 1 million members, and even received international praise for its treatment of Russian prisoners of war. During that time, Japan even raised $146,000 for American relief efforts after the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. During World War I, Japan and the Allies sent medical workers to Europe. However, during World War II, the military dictatorship suppressed these humanitarian values and greatly restricted the Japanese Red Cross from helping anyone outside Japan. Red Cross or any other medical aid rarely reached Allied prisoners of war, but there were exceptions. A myth is that the Japanese themselves did not have doctors, but they did, and their equipment was often labeled with the Red Cross. An army cannot function without medicine, and in war, particularly in jungle warfare, more soldiers may be lost to disease and infection than in actual battle. Doctors were valued for keeping the Japanese army in the fight, on land or at sea. Despite having doctors and medical staff trained similarly to their Allied counterparts, wounded Japanese soldiers still rarely surrendered. It was common for Japanese officers to shift tactics in propaganda when they knew they were fighting to the death. Faced with the possibility of imminent death, they might intensify the training of their soldiers, arguing that they were now facing Marine recruits pulled from prisons or psychiatric hospitals who would not surrender easily. This perspective meant facing brutal interrogations followed by guaranteed execution. The Japanese army also experimented with stimulants to amplify the fighting spirit. This included experimentation with methamphetamine, but there is much debate about its extent. Stimulants were said to sometimes be mixed into tea before an attack, and more commonly used by pilots. Stockpiles of these drugs, combined with the traumas of war, are considered a major contributing factor to a drug epidemic in post-war Japan. The Japanese, like the Allies, also had spiritual support accompanying their armies. The Japanese had Buddhist and Shinto leaders attached to imperial army regiments. The Japanese government actively sought to increase the presence of Japanese religion in foreign lands, to eliminate Christianity, and also to spread Japanese influence through religious means. Shinto and Buddhist leaders further sought to encourage sacrifice and bravery among Japanese soldiers. Japanese Shinto and the nationalist branches of Buddhism strongly encouraged placing the good of the community or the nation ahead of individualism. One might associate Buddhism with a religion of peace, but this is not always the case. Japan, even before the 1930s, had uncompromising nationalist Buddhist groups that preached war and aggressive religious expansion. Many monks were eager to join the war effort, just like the Red Cross. Less nationalist and more peaceful, Buddhist branches in Japan were suppressed. Buddhist branches with Chinese roots greater than Japanese Buddhist traditions also faced suppression by the government. In the end, Japan in the final months of the war lost as many doctors as soldiers to suicide attacks or defensive actions on Okinawa. The Himeyuri are an example of how desperate the Japanese were to fill medical roles at the end of the war. The Himeyuri were high school students, only 15 years old, who replaced field nurses and medical staff. 222 students and 18 teachers with limited training were briefly instructed to help Red Cross hospitals far from combat, but were positioned on the front line in caves and shelters, involved in operations including amputations. Most of them would not survive. Many were killed by American and Japanese crossfire, but many also committed suicide, believing they would suffer a terrible fate at the hands of American soldiers. As for the Japanese soldiers who shot at medics, almost none were brought to justice, at least not in a court. It was practically impossible to locate or identify living Japanese soldiers who committed these acts. Desmond Doss, an Army medic and Medal of Honor recipient, observed the Japanese obsession with attacking medical personnel. In an interview after the war, he stated, "For them, the most hated men in our army were the medics. They would let anyone go just to get us. They were taught to kill the medics because it shook the morale of the men, for if the medic disappeared, they would have no one to take care of them. All the medics were armed except me." The main reason for targeting medics was to damage American morale. If a soldier were wounded, it would be the action of a medic that would make the difference between life and death. If the medic were killed or incapacitated, there would be no immediate help for any other wounded soldier. For centuries, the designation of legitimate and illegitimate targets had been applied, both as a social convention and in informal treaties. Despite this, many simply ignored these restrictions to gain advantages on the battlefield. Help us keep this project alive here on YouTube by subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, God bless you all, and see you soon.